Welcome to Go Vote Omaha, presented by the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha. I'm Geri Simon, a League member and your host. Each week we talk about issues that are important for elections. We hope to inspire you to talk about those same issues, and then when election time comes around, we want to help you be ready and willing to go vote. This is another in a series that we're doing about the death penalty, and that's because you'll be voting on a ballot proposal in November on whether or not to retain the repeal of the death penalty that the unicameral passed in 2015. This evening we'll talk about legal issues and lethal injection, and to do that we have a guest, Berger. He's the Associate Faculty Dean for Faculty and a Professor of Law at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. And he teaches and researches constitutional law, and he also has expertise on the lethal injection for the death penalty, and he's also written extensively about that subject. Welcome, Professor Berger.
Thank you very much for having me.
Great. Why don't you start off by telling our viewers a little bit about your background and your work on lethal injection?
When I was in private practice in Washington, D.C. as a lawyer before I became a law professor, I had the opportunity to work on a couple of lethal injection cases, including one that made it to the U.S. Supreme Court. So I became interested in the issue then in my work in those cases, and I've followed up with that interest with several law review articles and continue to follow the issue as a scholar.
Okay. Why don't you tell our viewers what are the policy arguments used against the death penalty?
Well, I do think it's important to emphasize the policy arguments here. I really do believe that reasonable people can disagree about whether capital punishment is a just punishment. But I also feel that having spent a lot of time thinking about the death penalty, and the more I've thought about it, the more I think that whatever the theoretical arguments in favor of the death penalty, in practice, it really is deeply flawed. One major policy argument against it is that it's just very expensive. It costs much, much more to execute someone than it costs to keep them in prison for the rest of their life. That's partially because of the enormous cost of appeals and other legal challenges involved in the death penalty. It's also because most states that have capital punishment have a separate death row in their prisons for death row inmates, and those are more expensive to administer than the ordinary prison population. So that's one major policy problem, is that it's just very expensive. Another major policy issue is it risks executing the innocent. Our criminal justice system is deeply flawed. There have been over 150 death row inmates exonerated in the last 40 or so years. And of course, those problems of false convictions are not confined only to the death penalty. There are lots of instances of wrongly convicted people who aren't sentenced to death, but the problem seems especially serious when you have the death penalty because that punishment is irrevocable. You can't give someone back their life after killing them. Another policy problem with the death penalty is that it's arbitrarily applied. You hear proponents of the death penalty say, well, we will reserve it for the worst of the worst. That might be what you have it for in theory, but that's not how it works in practice. In practice, whether you get the death penalty or not has a lot less to do with the heinousness of your crime and a lot more to do with issues like the race of the victim, the race of the criminal defendant, the socioeconomic status of the criminal defendant, the geographical district in which the crime took place. And when you take all of those factors together, you realize that the heinousness of the crime really plays a very small role in deciding who gets the death penalty, and that who gets it and who doesn't is quite arbitrary. I think the final policy point to emphasize, though, is that there's really no reliable evidence that the death penalty serves as a deterrent to violent crime. That's one of the arguments that is sometimes made in favor of the death penalty, that it's a deterrent, but the reputable studies that have studied this really show that are really equivocal. They don't convincingly say that it isn't a deterrent, but they also make very clear that there's just not evidence to say that it's a deterrent. And those studies that argue that it is a deterrent have been pretty widely pulled apart by other studies that show just shoddy statistical evidence. So given the costs of the death penalty, the risk of error, and the fact that it's imposed so arbitrarily, and then given the fact that there's really no evidence that it serves as a deterrent, it seems like really an example of a failed government program.
Okay. And Nebraska was the 19th state to abolish the death penalty. So wouldn't we if we vote to reinstate it, aren't we going backwards in terms of the trend of how people are looking at it through the country?
Yeah, I think there is a bit of a trend against capital punishment. I think 7 states since 2007 have gotten rid of the death penalty. So there is a bit of a movement against it. I wouldn't overstate the trend. There's still over 30 states that have the death penalty, and I don't see states like Oklahoma and Texas getting rid of it soon. But there's sort of a slow push against the death penalty in terms of states getting rid of it. The more marked phenomenon is executions are way down and the imposition of death sentences are way down. If you look over the last decade, there's been a very steady trend of fewer executions and fewer death sentences. So if you take that and couple it with the states that have repealed the death penalty, you do see something of a trend against it.
Okay. But even if Nebraskans vote to reinstate the death penalty, are there other obstacles that would be in the way in terms of carrying it out?
Yeah, I think this is something that's really important for voters to keep in mind, is that even if Nebraska voters reinstate the death penalty in November, it's very likely that the state will not be able to carry out any executions, and that's for a number of reasons. One of the major reasons is the state just doesn't have the drugs. It doesn't have the drugs to carry out lethal injection now, and it's very, very difficult for it to get the drugs. Most major pharmaceutical companies have taken the stance that they don't want their drugs to be used in executions, and more drug companies are taking this position. In fact, Pfizer just announced that position within the last month or two. So it's hard. It was already hard to get the drugs. It's going to get even harder to get the drugs, which means that Nebraska would have the death penalty on the books and would incur all the expenses of having the death penalty, but wouldn't actually be able to carry out executions. Could they change their protocol to have other drugs? Yes, in theory, they could go through an administrative proceeding and adopt a different protocol. But the problem is that they would have trouble getting those drugs as well. And in fact, what's happened in many other states is they've changed their protocols to try to choose drugs that are easier to get. And then almost as soon as they've done that, those drugs have been difficult to get. So this is a problem. The problem of getting the drugs is a problem that I don't think is going away. Theoretically, the legislature could change the method altogether and do away with lethal injection and replace it with something like the firing squad or lethal gas, but there's no way that's going to happen. The legislature just voted to repeal the death penalty last year over the governor's veto. Even if there was some movement to get a different method, the opponents of the death penalty almost surely would filibuster that effort, and I just don't see there being a supermajority in the Nebraska legislature to get another method approved. So reinstating the death penalty would leave Nebraska in this curious situation where you have the death penalty on the books, you have the cost of the death penalty, but you're not actually able to carry out executions. And then the one final point I'll make about other obstacles is that there are other legal challenges that can and will arise with regards to the death penalty, and those will cost the state money, and they'll take time, and they'll also obstruct executions. To just give one example, the Supreme Court decided recently in a case out of Florida that Florida's death penalty system was unconstitutional. It violated the Sixth Amendment because a judge played too much of a role in imposing the death sentence rather than leaving it to a jury. The Nebraska death penalty system is pretty similar to the system that Florida has, which means that even if voters reinstated the death penalty, there's a chance that it would get struck down under that ruling. The Nebraska system is not identical to the Florida system, so it's not guaranteed to be struck down, but it is guaranteed there'd be a lot of expensive and time-consuming litigation about it, and there's a good chance it would be struck down as well.
Okay. In Nebraska, we didn't start out with lethal injection as a method of execution for the death penalty. It started with hanging and then moved to electrocution. And how did we get from the different methods to using lethal injection? Kind of a trend across the country too, I think.
So the Supreme Court, the Eighth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, and the Supreme Court of the United States has interpreted that provision as including the concept of evolving standards of decency. So just because a method of execution was constitutional 100 years ago doesn't mean it's still constitutional today. It depends on those evolving standards of decency. And some of those evolving standards of decency involve changed understanding of what an execution method actually does to a person, whether it actually inflicts pain. So Nebraska is a great example of this. We used to have the electric chair, and in fact, we're the last state to give up the electric chair. The Nebraska Supreme Court, in a case called Mata, struck down Nebraska's electric chair because it looked at the medical evidence and realized that there was a real chance that Nebraska inmates subjected to this would experience a torturous death. I think when the electric chair was first adopted, the hope was that it would be a painless method of execution, but as we understood the science of it better, we realized it could cause excruciating pain. So that got rid of the electrocution in Nebraska, and that was when Nebraska adopted lethal injection.
Lethal injection, okay. Well, tell our viewers that one of the things is, what is lethal injection? What actually happens to a person? What drugs do they use if they can't get anywhere? What's in the protocol for Nebraska to use?
Sure. Well, lethal injection procedures have changed quite a bit in various parts of the country. But interestingly, Nebraska uses the same method that most states used prior to 2009. Prior to 2009, all states used the same 3-drug protocol, and that's the same protocol Nebraska uses today.
Okay.
The first drug is sodium thiopental, a barbiturate anesthetic that is supposed to render the inmate completely unconscious and unresponsive to pain. The second drug, pancuronium bromide, is a paralytic that completely paralyzes the inmate. And the third drug, potassium chloride, stops the inmate's heart. I think everyone agrees that if the first drug, sodium thiopental, takes proper effect and in the right dose, it will completely knock the inmate out, and the inmate will not suffer during the execution. I think everyone also agrees that if the sodium thiopental does not take effect, if the inmate is insufficiently anesthetized, then the potassium chloride, the third drug, is excruciatingly painful as it courses its way through the veins to the inmate's heart. Some people have analogized this to being burned alive. One of the problems with the protocol is that the second drug, the paralytic, would conceal that pain. So if an inmate is not anesthetized from the thiopental, the paralytic would make it seem that the inmate is experiencing a painless death, but in fact the inmate would be experiencing the torturous feeling of being burned alive, and also the sensation of suffocation, because the paralytic also paralyzes the diaphragm.
Okay, but we've had no executions in Nebraska. Have we actually ever used lethal injection in the state? The last person to be executed was 97?
No, in fact, since the Supreme Court of Nebraska struck down the electric chair, Nebraska has not conducted any executions by lethal injection or any
at
other
all.
method.
And 1997 being the last time that we executed someone by electrocution.
And that's really no coincidence. I mean, lots of states are in the same predicament as Nebraska is, in which they have the death penalty on the books, but just functionally aren't able to carry out executions. There are a few states, Texas being the most notable, that carry out executions quite regularly, but most states are having real trouble carrying them out, and that's a combination of legal challenges to the actual, to a particular death sentences, for particular inmates, but in recent years it's also been real difficulty getting the drugs.
Okay, so let's talk about that a little bit. Some states have gone to great lengths to try to either get the drugs through other means, like trying to use veterinary drugs to carry out the death penalty. What has that really meant? We've heard something about botched executions in some states. So how does that play into the drugs that they're getting or using or in other states?
So states have had a real hard time getting the drugs. And as I mentioned earlier, many pharmaceutical companies don't want their products to be used in executions.
Right.
And that really has cut off supplies for many states. So states have really been scrambling. Some states, like Nebraska, have been forced onto the black market and have tried to purchase drugs illegally. We can maybe talk about that a little bit later. Other states have tried to purchase their drugs from compounding pharmacies. Compounding pharmacies play a very important role in our pharmaceutical economy and serve a very important purpose, but they're not licensed to manufacture the drugs that states are trying to get from them. Okay. And in many cases, they lack the necessary equipment to produce those drugs safely. So there are dangers that the drugs states are getting from these compounding pharmacies are really, might be tainted or contaminated in ways that can also increase the risk of pain. And again, this is a problem that is not going away. The states that have the death penalty, and if Nebraska adopts the death penalty again in November, it will continue to have these problems getting the drugs.
Getting the drugs, okay. Well, let's talk about that a little bit. The governor has been quite determined to carry out death sentences, and the state has gone to great lengths. I mean, he had the Department of Corrections try to purchase drugs, basically from a disreputable broker for the drugs, spent about $55,000. And was that legal? Was it that purchase attempt, was that a legal
No, it's pretty
action?
clear that it violated federal law. The federal law prohibits the importation of that particular drug, sodium thiopental. So the FDA was legally obligated to prevent that drug from coming into the country. And it's pretty disconcerting, I think, that the governor and some of the governor's people would try to illegally import a drug, in this case from India, to use in executions. I've heard different people speculate as to why they did that. One answer is that they didn't know it was illegal, which is a little disconcerting because many people, including myself, said at the time, no, it's very clear that federal law prohibits this. The other argument that I've heard is that it was a cynical effort on the part of the governor to try to influence the vote in the legislature. The governor announced he had the drugs the night before the legislature was taking an important vote on whether to repeal the death penalty. There were some of the swing senators in the unicameral who had said very candidly, look, I favor capital punishment in theory, but we can't get the drugs. We're spending all this money on the death penalty. Why should we keep the death penalty on the books if we can't carry out executions? The governor then swept in and said, oh, I have the drugs, don't worry about that.
Right.
So perhaps that was why he did it. I obviously was not privy to those conversations, so I don't know.
Right. Well, there's some people that say the tax dollars should be paid back to the state of Nebraska for.
Well, it would be great if the state could somehow get that money back.
Yes.
I don't know that will be so easy, but obviously it would be good if it could get the $55,000
Yes.
back.
And did the Attorney General weigh in on the decision at all, or was there anything said about that from his office?
I think the Nebraska Attorney General took the stand that the earlier precedent didn't apply in this case, which I think was the wrong legal reasoning. I'm not positive exactly what he said.
Well, we talked a little bit about botched executions, such as in Oklahoma, is a pretty famous one. So if you could talk about that a little bit, about what can go wrong and what has gone wrong, and why states have acted irresponsibly in designing lethal injection procedures.
So there have been several prominent botched executions. Probably the most prominent and the most horrific was the execution of Clayton Lockett in Oklahoma a couple of years ago. Clayton Lockett was on the gurney and he started convulsing and bucking, trying to get off the gurney in obvious agony, even though he should have been anesthetized and should have been paralyzed. At that point, Oklahoma officials closed the blinds so the media and other witnesses couldn't see exactly what happened. They did try to halt the execution, but Mr. Lockett subsequently died. There are many different factors that can contribute to a botched execution. One of them that is inherent in lethal injection, and that was one of many problems in the Lockett execution, was setting the catheter in the inmate's vein. To have lethal injection, you need to inject the drugs into the inmate's veins. But many inmates have compromised veins due to drug abuse or other health problems. And many states don't employ qualified people to set the catheter properly in the inmate's veins. So obviously, if the catheter slips, then the injection isn't going into the inmate's vein, and then the inmate is not going to get the requisite dose of anesthetic to prevent the inmate from experiencing excruciating pain, which, as we've already talked about, the 3-drug protocol, which not all states, but many states, including Oklahoma, uses. Other problems in Oklahoma included, instead of using thiopental, they use a different drug, midazolam, as their first drug, as the anesthetic. There's a lot of evidence suggesting that midazolam, in fact, is not a suitable anesthetic and cannot guard against the kind of pain inflicted by potassium chloride. The Supreme Court upheld it, but there is some medical evidence suggesting that that's not the case. I think the sort of broader overarching point, and this was an issue in Oklahoma and it's an issue in many states, is that lethal injection is hard to carry out. It's a complicated process that requires people with real expertise doing lots of things at different stages in the procedure. And many states don't have the resources or the personnel to carry it out safely. So I already mentioned the problems with a catheter. You need someone who can properly set the catheter in the veins. Another person that you really need in lethal injection is somebody to monitor the anesthetic depth of the inmate, particularly states that use the 3-drug protocol to say, well, this person is sufficiently anesthetized so that you can inject the second and third drugs. Many states haven't employed such a person or haven't employed a qualified person. In Missouri, which was the case I worked on, the doctor who was in charge of the lethal injection procedure subsequently admitted to being dyslexic and confessed he had no idea how much of the anesthetic he was mixing, which meant that there was no way to know if the inmates had actually received the right amount of anesthetic before they got the paralytic and the potassium chloride. So that just gives you a sense of how many different stages there are, and if you don't have well-trained, well-qualified people in those positions, there are often going to be problems, and given the drugs that many states have selected, those problems can result in excruciating pain, which is what happened in the Clayton Lockett case.
Okay. You wrote about why states have failed to address lethal injection risks and why some are so strongly resisting disclosure of their procedures and details about lethal injection. So why are they failing in disclosing the risks and so resistant to disclosing procedures?
That's a great question. And it's hard to know for certain why states act the way they do, but I think, having spent quite a bit of time looking at this, I think states adopt secrecy measures for basically 2 reasons. And in my mind, one of those reasons is legitimate, or at least arguably legitimate, and the other one is illegitimate. The legitimate reason is I think states want to insulate their personnel from possible harassment from outsiders who oppose the death penalty. And they also want to protect the drug suppliers from that kind of harassment. So I understand that kind of secrecy, saying we don't want the names and identities of our execution team members and our drug suppliers to be disclosed to the public. The problem, though, is that most states have adopted secrecy measures that go way beyond just protecting the identity of the people who are participating in lethal injection. They insulate most or all of the procedure's details from public disclosure, and that really isn't necessary to protect the identity of the people involved. What it does do is it helps the state conceal their mistakes and helps prevent inmates from finding out in advance real protocol flaws that could prevent against excruciating executions. So to the extent that states use secrecy to try to protect against their own mistakes being discovered, it's pretty disheartening.
Okay. Has that been challenged at the courts at all?
There have been some challenges. Courts have been pretty hands-off. Courts give states a lot of leeway to design their lethal injection procedures, although I've written that I think there's a pretty good due process argument that inmates should have a right to the information that will help illuminate whether the lethal injection procedure creates a substantial risk of excruciating pain.
Okay. No death penalty for Nebraska, if we vote to retain the repeal, means life in prison without parole. But those advocating reinstatement have said that a person could possibly be paroled. So could you just talk about that real briefly?
My understanding is that under Nebraska law, life means life. So life in prison in Nebraska means life in prison without parole. So there's really no chance of parole. The only chance for the sentence to be reduced is to have the Pardons Board committee reduce the sentence, and that is extremely unlikely. The Pardons Board is made up of the governor, the attorney general, and the secretary of state, and it's extremely improbable that that board would reduce the sentence of a dangerous murderer who is serving a life sentence in Nebraska. So in theory, yes, there is a mechanism to reduce the sentence of people in prison, but in practice, that's not going to happen. And I think it's a little bit disingenuous to say that that's a real legitimate threat. So in other words, if Nebraskans retain the repeal of the death penalty, so we no longer have capital punishment, the worst of the worst will be sentenced to life in prison, and that will mean life in prison.
Okay. And just going back briefly to drugs and lethal injection, one question I wanted to ask is, does expiration or life of the drug have anything to do with, does that affect states using the drug?
So that is another issue that states have run into,
Okay.
including Nebraska a few years ago wasn't able to use some drugs because they had expired. So that makes it more difficult as well. The states have trouble getting the drugs, but then they need to make sure they get them in a window where they can actually use them when they can carry out the sentence. Other states have had problems with arguably using drugs that were expired. Oklahoma actually recently admitted to having accidentally injected the wrong drug in executing an inmate. So there are all kinds of problems that can arise.
That can arise with that, okay. Well, anything else that you think our voters should know about the death penalty and lethal injection? I mean, obviously Nebraska has no experience even using it, so.
I mean, I do think reasonable people can disagree about the propriety of capital punishment as a moral issue. And I'm sympathetic to some of the arguments in favor of capital punishment. I have mixed feelings on it. I told you that I represented people on death row.
Yes.
And when I represented my client, Michael Taylor, in Missouri, I spent a lot of time on the phone with him. And I became convinced during our phone calls that he was a very, very different person than he had been at the time 20 years earlier when he had committed his terrible crime. Mm-hmm. So I find capital punishment troubling to the extent that it cuts off that effort for redemption. And I find it morally troubling for that reason. But I am sympathetic to the arguments that some people deserve the worst punishment. But I really feel that this is not a college ethics class or a philosophy class. We need to evaluate not capital punishment in theory, but capital punishment in practice. Okay. And in the real world, it's expensive, it's error prone, and it doesn't really deter crime.
Well, thank you so much for giving information to our viewers. I think we've covered some important points on this issue. Okay. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for hosting me.
For the League of Women Voters, I'm Geri Simon, reminding you to inform yourself about the issues at election time. Go vote, Omaha.